On today's World Insight, Afghanistan in the grips of renewed conflict as the U.S. and its allies are set to withdraw forces. Prospects of peace amid the fighting. And China and Argentina, geographically half a world apart, but they have grown closer amid the pandemic. A former Argentinian trade and agriculture expert weighs in on the blossoming relationship and the ugly geopolitics over COVID's origins.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The U.S. has started drawing down forces from Afghanistan, set to pull out of the country by August 31st. It's the end of America's longest war that spanned through 2 decades, if not more. But fighting in Afghanistan has intensified since May. Recently, the Taliban have taken 3 more provincial capitals in Afghanistan as they forge ahead with a bid to control the country. Many Afghan cities and about half of the country's 34 provinces have been the scene of heavy battles and street fighting. This week, special representatives from Afghanistan, China, the U.S., Russia, and Pakistan will meet in Qatar and other places to resume peace negotiations on the Afghan conflict. Meanwhile, during a recent visit to China, the Taliban's political chief said the group is sincere about seeking peace and is willing to work with other parties for a political arrangement that is acceptable to all Afghan people. For more on the latest in Afghanistan, let's loop in our panelists. For the latest situation in Afghanistan, we are joined in Detroit, Saeed Khan, lecturer of the Near East and Asian Studies with Global Studies at Wayne State University. In Atlanta, Tabish Flo, who is the Afghan writer and political analyst. In Boston, Jim Walsh, Senior Research Associate at MIT Security Studies Program. In Beijing, He Wenping, Professor from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Ladies and gentlemen, what a pleasure to see all of you. Now, latest situation in Afghanistan is changing as we speak. What is your latest assessment, Mr. Flo, since you were in Afghanistan at least 2 years ago?
Thank you for the invite. Hello to all of the panelists. The situation is very much concerning. The advances of the Taliban around major cities, particularly in Helmand and Lashkar-Gah, but also in the north of the country in around Aibak, which is perhaps the second largest city in the north, close to Mazar Sharif, and other provincial capitals, is concerning, creating a humanitarian crisis in the midst of a full-scale war. What is happening is that the Doha deal that's supposed to provide a venue for talks and the sort of assurances that provides a path to negotiation, that deal is doomed and failed. The Taliban strategy of waiting out the United States has proved to work, and now they're focused on the strategy of exhausting Afghanistan's government politically and militarily. So what is happening in Afghanistan is a crisis of many folds. Unfortunately, the cost of this war and the major burden of this war is on the ordinary Afghans who are suffering. Tens of thousands of people are displaced, internally displaced. Refugee camps are almost everywhere around major cities like Kandahar and even in the capital, Kabul. People are fleeing a humanitarian crisis and making. So what is happening is, I think, creating not just a political and military crisis, but also something that the region should be alarmed and should be aware of.
Mr. Khan, what is your assessment, particularly when it comes to the region?
Well, I think first of all, I'm not sure that the takeover of the Taliban is much of a surprise, although the speed by which they're doing it is quite shocking. They have been very effective in the speed by which they have been able to take over several provincial capitals. But as far as the region is concerned, nature abhors a vacuum. And what we've seen in the past is that when it comes to Afghanistan, there has always been a concern that left to its own devices, whether it was during the 1990s, which spawned the Taliban in the first place, when the United States had pulled its support out after the Soviet invasion and occupation, there was this danger of a vacuum. Now we find, though, that there are enough regional players that if there is some kind of a coordinated effort made by countries like Iran, Pakistan, China, of course, perhaps even India, there is a possibility of a stabilization when it comes to Afghanistan. Now, that's not going to prevent the inevitability of the Taliban becoming the dominant force within Afghanistan. But as far as issues of humanitarian crisis, the aversion of anarchy, there is the possibility and the prospect that regional cooperation can and will be an effective measure.
I see. Mr. Walsh, since you are based in the U.S., let me ask you more about the U.S. side. What is exactly that final plan of withdrawal, 22 days or 21 days from now? Meanwhile, what does that mean, the Air Force now that is going on, and later, after the withdrawal, what is the U.S. plan?
Well, in some ways, we've seen it both in President Biden's words and in reaction to recent events. So I think many commentators have pointed to the fact that you've had a very accelerated pace, as my colleagues have pointed to, of Taliban military victories on the ground, 2 top-tier cities, and then other cities as well. And the U.S., hasn't reversed course, and its response to most recent events would suggest that it's going to do what it is doing, which is it'll provide air support if the government requests it, but it will continue its withdrawal of assets and people who worked with the U.S. government, translators, and continue on the path that it's currently on. It is not getting back in Afghanistan.
Let me come back to you, Mr. Floor, about the latest situation in Afghanistan, because for many of us from outside Afghan, it's very hard to understand all the nuances, but there are enormous amount of nuances, even just within the Taliban itself and within, of course, the Afghan government forces itself as well. How should we understand this, Mr. Floor?
A war of 40 years is always have to be or is complicated. Do not forget that there is a regional support network, sanctuaries, military and political support provided to the Taliban. This is a fact. But at the same time, internally, Afghans failed to do their homeworks of providing better governance, better services delivered to the public. And this has created a sort of disarray and sort of anarchy that at the time of crisis is not providing the support that a government needs. So there is the possibility of public switching sides to the Taliban, not just because the Taliban are a popular force, but because the government has not been able to provide the security and the safety that is needed for the public to stand and hold on the cities. At the same time, unfortunately, the government of Ghani, with his cronies and partners, have no sort of grand war plan. They don't have the resilience, they don't have the political acumen and the resilience in terms of strategic thinking to defend Afghanistan and to sort of see the whole picture of not just war, but of course regional diplomacy, peacemaking, and at the same time stabilizing the region. Throughout the 7 years of Ghani's presidency, he has provided this false assurances to people. But what we see is now that was shallow, empty, and not tangible. And at the same time, the other element of the nuance is that the rushed, irresponsible withdrawal of forces from Afghanistan created that political vacuum. And now it's felt not just by the Taliban, but also by the regional actors, which is creating another round, another era of uncertainty and confusion.
Mr. Khan, also about the Afghan government, there has always been a practice that it is only controlling the capital and the surrounding area. That is no secret to anyone in the world anymore. But what about its situation now, given the strongholds of Taliban and the fighting capabilities of Taliban, one must assume there could be a lot of complexities within the so-called government forces and the Afghan government.
Absolutely. I think we've seen now that the Kabul regime, as Mr. Farouk very eloquently articulated, is really a shell of a regime, made more so without any kind of an external support for it. We saw with the Doha talks, there was this rather half-hearted effort in the closing overs of the Trump administration to try to finally court the Taliban regime, to bring it to the negotiation table, perhaps to placate some last-minute favors and concessions. But the Taliban, of course, as has already been said, played the waiting game. They played it very effectively, and they realized that Doha was more for perhaps American domestic consumption than it really was for changing any facts on the ground.
Is it for more American domestic consumption, including the withdrawal of American forces in such a abrupt way, just within a few months? And of course, things would change dramatically, Mr. Walsh. Of course, I will also go to the Chinese issue with Madam He, but a bit later, Mr. Walsh.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be careful here. There are a lot of folks, and we've talked about, well, you and I have talked about Afghanistan many times, and there are a lot of folks who said the U.S. should not be in Afghanistan. International critics in the regions didn't want U.S. troops in Afghanistan. And I get that. But then when they leave, you can't turn around and say, oh, it's terrible, they're leaving, it's causing instability. I mean, you can't have it both ways. So I think definitely one of my colleagues said, and I'm sympathetic to this, yes, the U.S. is leaving quickly, and yes, things are falling quickly. But tell me, how many circumstances do you have where people take their time leaving? That's not the way the thing works. If you've decided to get out, and there was writing on the wall, Trump said it, everyone should have known that when Trump made that initial movement towards getting out, that was going to pave the way for Biden to do it. The U.S. had been there 20 years. 20 years.
Yeah. Dr. Khan,
Exactly.
I have to let you respond to that.
I fully agree, and actually, if I may just provide one point of modification. The United States has actually been in Afghanistan in some capacity for the last 42 years, directly with military on the ground, of course, since 2001. But with the military support that it was providing for the Mujahideen going all the way back to 1979. So the kind of fatigue that had set in with the United States, along with, of course, when it comes to the American public, the ill-fated ventures into Iraq and other campaigns in the Middle East, and of course always the looming specter of Vietnam, which festered. And of course it's no coincidence that parallels are being made to the seemingly hasty withdrawal of American troops now, to April of 1975 when Saigon fell, and the scenery and the imagery of American helicopters evacuating the embassy in Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City. So these kinds of depictions are ones that are etched quite strongly in the American consciousness, and do in fact then help to drive public opinion, especially one regarding whether America should be in Afghanistan any longer.
But the question also was, originally, was it right to be in Afghanistan, at least in Afghanistan in such a way? That's also a question, isn't it, Dr. Khan, briefly?
Well, I think historians are going to be debating this probably for certainly far longer than I'm going to be around. But at least in the short term, we can say, coming up on the 20th anniversary of September 11th and the attacks, that there was merit, given the fact that Al-Qaeda was in fact located within Afghanistan, before Osama bin Laden, of course, crossed the border into Pakistan, that military strikes were going to be necessary, given the fact that at the time the Taliban were harboring Al-Qaeda and were unwilling to then extradite Osama bin Laden or any other members of Al-Qaeda.
I see.
How limited that campaign should have been is, of course, the big debate. And certainly it's very hard to justify going well beyond that to being almost 20 years, especially given the fact that bin Laden was killed 10 years ago, and not even in Afghanistan.
Yeah. And Mr. Forlu, I have to let you come in just to be fair.
I mean, I agree to most of the points by my colleagues, but let's remember also that the U.S. peace envoy, he had this mantra that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. The peace deal with the Taliban should have provided, let me say, that wasn't a peace deal. That was rather a sort of surrender deal, right? An exit deal. That deal should have elements of peacemaking. No one with sane understanding of history and complexity of the region would argue for an infinite presence of the United States in the region. And honestly, as Dr. Khan said, I'm also a student of history, no international power or foreign force can ever change the fate of a nation. That is for sure, we can agree on this. But what we wanted, but what partnership meant at the time of making deal with the Taliban, was to make sure that we use all the leverages of the United States that had on the table militarily and politically while doing the peace negotiations with the Taliban. At current moment, the United States seems to lose the war and also losing the peace. That is the equation that needs to be discussed.
Madam He, you've been listening attentively to your colleagues. Your thoughts on this question, the U.S. presence in Afghanistan, whether it's 20 or 42 years?
Well, I think I agree with our colleagues in Atlanta, maybe. So I think the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan obviously is too hasty. It's not that responsible at all. Don't mention they have been based there for 20 years, not bring any peace and security in that country, and even the final this moment. Actually, just one example. So one of the base, military base, the U.S. troops just withdraw even without any notice to Afghanistan government. Only 2 or 3 days later, so when those Afghanistan military forces and came over to that military base, and they found all those American troops has gone. So why is that? Because for the Biden administration, the #1 concern is to make 0 casualty, 0 wounded American soldiers, in all the process of withdrawal. So that is not in their concern to make sure the peaceful transition for this withdrawal. So that's why we have come across this kind of a civil conflict immediately come up.
Ms. He, as the other guest mentioned, Chinese State Council Foreign Minister Wang Yi met already with the Taliban leaders. What is China trying to paint the picture about?
Yeah, I don't think our Foreign Minister Wang Yi met with a high level of Taliban means now China already recognized Taliban as the the so-called de facto government. That's not the equal with that, because we are trying to help Taliban themselves now is in the process of transformation themselves. They want to change themselves from some kind of this religious group and extremist group now becoming a ruling party, a political party in the future of Afghanistan. So we just trying to get to know them better, because we are familiar with Afghanistan Ghani government. So now we need the time and the chance to get familiar with this changeable, in the process of transformation, this Taliban. So in the talk, I think our Foreign Minister Wang Yi made very clear, we asked the Taliban to cut a clear this demarcation with those extremists and stop, have no support to any those Xinjiang, those terrorist group in Xinjiang. And also Taliban made a promise they will not allow any this kind of intention to use the soil of Taliban to make any attack to China. So I think all those messages are very good. And also after this peace has been there, and China also is willing to offer the help to rebuild this Afghanistan, to rebuild the peace and the development. This is even, we have been talking about how to extend the One Belt, One Road from Pakistan all the way to Afghanistan. So we are willing to do that. So I think this meeting between Foreign Minister Wang Yi and the Taliban high-level official, high-level delegation, I think is very positive way.
Okay. Mr. Khan, of course, Afghanistan is a very crucial country. That's why we're seeing enormous amount of uncertainties in that region. And it is having a huge impact on all the countries in the region and even beyond. Mr. Khan, what do you think should be in that best scenario to achieve that? What's going to be the role of everybody?
Well, I'm not sure how much of a role the United States is going to continue to play, or for that matter, really Western countries. I think they've demonstrated their lack of understanding of the geopolitics of the region. They have also demonstrated their lack of commitment to the region. And whenever there is a regional issue, that is best left to regional players, those that actually share borders with Afghanistan, not ones that are thousands upon thousands of miles away, which then brings countries like Iran, Pakistan, India, China, and maybe some of the former Soviet republics to the north. One of the main issues that has to, of course, be then contended is that Afghanistan should not be the playground for other regional countries' proxy wars. We found, unfortunately, that Pakistan and India have used Afghanistan, leveraged and exploited it in order to fight their antagonistic relationship. You have Iran that, of course, is going to be concerned with the treatment of the Shia population in the West at the hands of the Taliban. So they're going to feel as though they're stakeholders. And then, as Dr. Ho has noted, China's rather ambitious Belt and Road Initiative is going through Afghanistan, along with its investments with Pakistan through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the CPEC, as well as the $400 billion over 25-year commitment in investment that they've made with Iran. And so I think what we're seeing here then is two things. One is that China is not necessarily concerned about ideological issues regarding the Taliban and other players in the region, including Iran, which is a theocracy. They're interested in stability, and they're interested in consistency and continuity. And similarly, I think it's important to recognize that Beijing acknowledges that the Taliban are pragmatic. They are not necessarily irrational players in the region. They're not ideologically beholden. After all, if they were, they would not, in fact, be negotiating with Beijing. They would have some kind of theological or ideological antagonism toward China. But they are negotiating at a very sophisticated level. And this, I think, is something that, unfortunately, the United States and the Western countries never really understood about the Taliban. Now, that's not a defense of anything that the Taliban is doing, particularly the humanitarian crisis that they are creating within Afghanistan. But if we are to look at this in a geopolitical lens, then it's important to go ahead and acknowledge what are the realities of the situation.
But on the other hand, Mr. Khan, just to follow up, many would say it is also unfair. On the one hand, you talk about the regional players should not use Afghanistan as a place of proxy war. That certainly is well understood. But on the other hand, many would say this has been a practice for decades, if not more than 100 years, that Western powers, quote unquote, some would say, come into a region, stir it up, unable to bring it to stability and probably even more to chaos. And then the regional players have to come in, like it or not, to deal with the situation because their life and death are also on the line as a result of whether that region, stirred earlier by the others, are in peace or not. So this is a very interesting topic that has been with us for decades. Mr. Khan, your thoughts briefly.
I think it's a very, very valid observation that you make. And the fact that each of these regional players has a stakehold in the stability of Afghanistan as being a bigger priority than their own petty differences, perhaps then provides us with some modicum of hope. The destabilization of Afghanistan will have a ripple effect by creating then issues for India on its border. Certainly, we've seen that it has had a negative impact on Pakistan as well as Iran. And as Dr. Ho has pointed out, there's already a policy consideration for China to protect itself from any kind of spillover into its borders from
Right.
Afghanistan. So if that it can be recognized by these regional players, then they will perhaps have the impetus to work together, or even if not work together, at least not work in opposition to one another in order to provide stability in Afghanistan.
Mr. Furlow, only fair that I let you to come in also comment about that.
The relationship between the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Lashkar-e-Tayyiba, and the rest of the terrorist organization has not been cut yet. This umbrella of support, this nexus of or ecosystem of terror will certainly destabilize the region unless the United States, the regional powers, including China, India, Russia, and of course Pakistan, pressure the Taliban to make sure that the certain assurances and guarantees are in place if the Taliban are becoming part of the ruling system in Afghanistan to avoid regional chaos by the extremist and by the terrorist organizations.
Thank you so much, every one of you contributing from your own perspective. Saeed Khan, Tabish Farouk, Jim Walsh, He Wenping. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The South American country Argentina, despite carrying out one of the most severe lockdowns in the world, has surpassed 100,000 COVID-19 deaths last month. The country has come to grips with the tragic deaths by ramping up its vaccination campaign. Recently, China's Sinopharm provided 7 million doses of vaccines to Argentina, with 24 million doses more to follow. Now, the country has achieved a 50% vaccination rate with one COVID dose. Earlier, I spoke to Gustavo Gerardo, a former consultant to the Ministry of Economy, Foreign Affairs, and Agriculture of Argentina. Speaking of COVID-19's origin, he said China is seen as an easy target. It's the first country that notified the world about the coronavirus, not covering it up. Let's listen in. We know the Delta variant of COVID-19 is becoming the biggest challenge now for the world. How is the situation in your country?
Well, the situation in Argentina is getting harder, you know. It was easier at the start because the measures that our new government, because at that time, my government changed it at the end of 2019. The virus couldn't spread in my country at the first time, but after that, you know, the situation getting worse for everywhere around the world. So it was impossible for the resources of my country to sustain these conditions. With the vaccines, with the cooperation from China and Russia also, we are getting many of medicines to sustain the situation. I hope really that for the end of this 2021, we just arrived to the 90% of our population covered with the medicines. You know?
Yeah. Did you have the vaccines?
Yes, I have the first doses of the Sputnik V, the first one, and we are in the middle of the process to get the second one. In my case, in my personal case, maybe Sinopharm in the maybe next 2 weeks. I hope so.
Good for you, and all the best to you and your family, of course. We see vaccines are very important commodities, but there's also debates about vaccines. There's anti-science discussions. How do you see all of the latest?
Well, in this sense, we suffer the same unconscious for many parts of the population. They spread the virus without any intention. Get the vaccines and please get the doses for everywhere, that it's not a problem for the people. This is the only way that we can avoid the hundred of murders every day, at least in my country, maybe it's an average 400 murders per day. It's a very huge number, and we are suffering a lot with it.
On the other hand, you see the debate about the origin of the virus, which is certainly, as we all understand in common sense, a science issue. It's already become a political issue.
Es un problema que no se presenta por primera vez.
Well, this is not the first time this problem appears. What happens is that it's a very propitious moment for the international debate to focus and aim its guns at an economy that much of the Western Hemisphere considers and has decided to consider as one of its enemies. And this is the People's Republic of China. But all scientific assessments have not been able to prove so far that the virus had its origin in the People's Republic of China.
Trajo como consecuencia que se le apuntara, se le acusara.
In fact, according to the scientific analyses that I have read, there is certain evidence that a history similar to COVID-19 manifested in other parts of Italy, also in Southeast Asia and in the United States itself, with people who before December 2019 showed physical symptoms similar to those who suffer from COVID, which manifested as a very strong flu, which have not been evaluated correctly because the patients also died, so it was not possible to know for sure what had been the origin of their discomfort.
Propios Estados Unidos con personas que antes de diciembre del 2019
And it's a very propitious, very convenient moment for those who have China as a target, that have the political objective to halt the progress by pointing it as the culprit of this
han
situation.
podido ser evaluadas correctamente.
But, from my point of view, China has been able to demonstrate quickly that first, after opening all its institutions to the international assessment of the World Health Organization, its laboratories and its institutional framework, up to now, has not been found out the specific origin of the coronavirus. So at this moment, no one can be accused of being the origin of a genetic mutation, which in any case is as we blamed Spain for having been the culprit of the Spanish flu 100 years ago, or blamed any African country for having been the origin of Ebola.
La señalaran como la culpable de esta situación.
It happens that, unfortunately, China is today occupying a very important place at the international level. Your opinion is very important, and your voice is the voice of developing economies. So that has led to the People's Republic of China being singled out as the guilty economy, because it is necessary to find a culprit when the problem becomes a political problem.
Problema se transforma en un problema político. Ya está, Valentina.
Right. And there's also the politicization of the whole issue, from vaccination to distribution. It seems that we are making ourselves disappointed.
Lo voy a decir en español, Valentina, para no meter la pata.
In the case of my country and China, for many years they have maintained close cooperation on various topics of interest to both economies, and particularly since the beginning of this 21st century. On this occasion, luckily, it was no different, and the Argentine government highly values the cooperation scheme that it developed with the People's Republic of China during the pandemic.
Y el gobierno argentino valora.
Argentina, up to now, has been quite satisfied with the cooperation because it allows the country to see in a real and concrete situation how the cooperation above between the two governments that are working together is materialized, so that the pandemic affects us as little as possible.
De este problema global salimos todos juntos o no sale nadie.
Regarding the consequences, I understand that it is a very good opportunity for China to offer developing economies all its operational capacities to assist those of us who have less advantages, and to demonstrate its action, that assistance is not empty words, and that this gesture and this attitude of the People's Republic of China differs remarkably from other economies that are also very powerful, which prioritize assisting their domestic front exclusively, without considering the needs of others.
A los cuales les ha costado mucho.
Because in my country, the government knows that no one can solve this problem alone. We all come out of this global problem together, or no one comes out. I think that China has understood this and believes the same.
Atravesado esta penosa situación una vez que concluya. Ya está, Valentina.
Mr. Guiado, I understand your country, its economy, has been going through its ups and downs over the decades. You had your happy moments. You also had your very challenging times. As an advisor for the Ministry of Economy, Foreign Affairs, and Agriculture, how do you reflect upon those moments? What do you think are the biggest lessons and takeaways from those moments?
Históricamente, Argentina es un gran proveedor de productos agroalimenticios.
Historically, Argentina is a great supplier of agri-food products, and there's a strong concentration of these food products in the owners of the capital. Every time my country, politics, has tried to disarm that historical situation that has been going on for more than 200 years, there has been an agreement between the military power and those who have the most money to overthrow democratic governments. This has happened in my country repeatedly, establishing dictatorships that have altered the democratic order. The crises in my country have to do with Argentina selling what the world eats or the world uses for food. So those owners of these food always want the Argentine currency to devalue because they can thus charge much more money for the product they sell. The other side of the same coin is that the real wage in Argentina gets reduced to the fact that food increases its price. Argentina can then generate a strong dependence on growing through the dollar currency that comes in from new sales of our products abroad.
La otra cara de la misma moneda.
We have to change the productive matrix in my country to make money come from other sectors that are not exclusively macro foods. That's where we are at right now.
There are a lot of mechanisms around the world, multilateral mechanisms and projects. For example, the Belt and Road Initiative. There were suggestions in some media reports in Argentina about the interest coming from Argentina to participate into the BRI, which is about infrastructure building, connectivity, ESG, and now there's more sustainable development involvement in it. Tell me more about your thoughts about those potentials.
En virtud que no forma parte del proyecto original porque no hay ninguna relación.
My country has politically decided, at least to say, that it will be part of the Belt and Road Initiative that will adhere to the Politburo's political project. In turn, when they developed the new communication route, the initiative based on 5G, the Internet of Things and artificial intelligence, the communication mechanisms that can more closely link with Latin America with the People's Republic of China seem to be the beginning of a very powerful and close relationship. Because today, communication mechanisms bring borders closer and make that famous cultural distance much smaller. But over time, today in my country, the Chinese community is the fourth most important. The number of Chinese, of people with Chinese origin residing in my country is very large, and that has brought an empathy, a bond, a much greater knowledge of your culture, to the point that no longer this is a strange to us, and that an initiative such as the Belt and Road is already seen with other eyes that are much more receptive, positive, and optimistic. To be more precise regarding what may eventually be a much closer collaboration between Chinese capitals, who together with Argentine capitals could come to my country to develop those things that China has a surplus, which are infrastructure, technology, and financing.
Infraestructura, tecnología y financiamiento. Termine, Valen.
Very interesting prospect you have just painted because there are a lot of discussions about what might be that combination, when Argentina joining Belt and Road Initiative and when China and Argentina could work closer than before. How do you see that?
Entiendo. Durante los últimos 25 años.
I understand. During the last 25 years, capitalism underwent an enormous transformation regarding the way of doing things. Now, global value chains are the ones that govern the way products are made. They are not made in one country. They are not only made in China. They are not only made in Argentina, but the production processes go through different countries. The People's Republic of China gathered this knowledge by participating in these global value chains first in those stages in which it could do so with its own resources, very modest, very poor, which are very abundant labor, products of low technological composition. But as China learned, it began to know how to do it, how to have the idea, how to patent it, how to learn to innovate through science and technology policies created by national champions with indigenous innovation. Argentina can learn a lot from these mechanisms. Then, China learns to market, learns to distribute, and Chinese companies participate in the entire chain together with companies from all over the world. But the products are no longer made in one place. Transnational products come to Argentina, but they are sent from China. China is part of a global value chain, and the interdependence of capitals makes peace much more possible because many more interests are affected if there's no peace. Now it is convenient there are routes, airports, ports, infrastructure, because all this allows a more homogeneous benefit of all those participating in the production process. And that makes cooperation more possible, and that although we are far away, China and Argentina can work together in the joint production in the world of products for Argentina, for China, and for the rest of the world. And that's where I think there are very good prospects.
Un más homogéneo beneficio de todos aquellos que participan del proceso de producción.
And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more Search World Insight, check out our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching.